In the middle of the night, I heard my son whisper to his wife, "That filthy old woman should get out of here. Once she's gone, everything will be ours." A faint clink of glasses echoed in the dark, a crisp sound that sliced straight through my heart. The next morning I walked out that door taking with me $9 million they never knew existed. I'm glad you're here. If you're watching this video, hit like, subscribe, and tell me where you're listening to this story from. I woke up in the middle of the night to the murmur of voices coming from the living room. The suburban house north of Seattle was usually silent after 10, but tonight, the faint blue glow of the TV seeped through the crack beneath the door. I stood barefoot on the cold wooden floor. My name is Margaret Holden, 68 years old, widowed. I'd moved up here from Oregon 6 months ago because my son Ethan told me, "It's not safe for you to live alone." And I believed him. I leaned close to the wall and heard the soft scrape of a chair. Melissa, his wife, said something quietly. Then Ethan's voice, low, deliberate, each word pressed out like he didn't want to wake anyone but didn't care who might hear. "That filthy old woman should get out of here. Once she's gone, everything will be ours." A faint clink of glasses followed. The sharp ring of crystal on crystal brief, clean cutting, was enough to tell me they were toasting to a plan. I couldn't see their faces, only two shadows leaning into each other, shoulders touching, a foggy wine bottle glinting on the table. I stood there, frozen, my heartbeat crawled up my throat. There was no pretending I'd misheard. I backed into my room and closed the door. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I pressed my trembling hands against my knees to keep them still. My husband's photo sat on the nightstand beside the lamp. He was wearing a white shirt the day we signed the papers for our first house in Eugene, smiling the honest kind of smile that felt like sunlight. I looked at that smile and asked silently, how did they become like this? The ceiling loomed dark. The clock read 2:17 a.m. I couldn't fall back asleep. I lay on my side, eyes open, while memories played backward in my mind like an old film reel. Ethan at 5, running into the kitchen demanding pancakes. Ethan in 7th grade, standing on stage at the science fair, scanning the crowd for my face. Ethan on his wedding day, pinning a flower to his lapel and hugging me tight. The warmth of family dinners, the laughter, the small talk, all of it crumbled away like old paint being scraped off a wall, exposing the cold plaster underneath. From the hallway came a faint laugh, then the TV went silent, muted. Maybe I could even hear the clinking of ice in their glasses as they poured more whiskey. Then came footsteps on the stairs. A shadow paused outside my door, then moved on. I sat up straight in the darkness, counting my breaths, waiting for every sound to fade again. Outside, the wind brushed against the trees in the yard. And I wondered, how long has it been since I made a decision for myself instead of doing what my only son told me? The minute hand crawled forward. When the eastern sky began to turn gray, I stood up and drew the curtains open just a bit. The chill of the Seattle dawn slipped through the window crack and kissed my face. I whispered to myself, and to the man in the picture frame on the table, today won't be like yesterday. I put on my sweater, slid my feet into soft-soled shoes, and opened the door. The hallway was silent. The TV was off. I went downstairs. The coffee machine made a short hiss as it powered on. I poured the grounds into the filter, filled the reservoir, and waited. As I sat there sipping my coffee, I began to really think and realize the signs had been there all along. But I'd trusted them too much, brushed everything aside. Now, one by one, the memories came flooding back, fitting together like pieces of a puzzle. Every single one of them made sense. Every single one was part of a plan. 6 months earlier, the red brick house in Eugene, Oregon. That day, Melissa brought over an apple pie and set it on the kitchen table like a ritual offering. Ethan hugged me, the smell of fresh laundry clinging to his shirt. "Mom, you shouldn't be living alone anymore. In Seattle, you'll have us. The grandkids, you'll be so much happier." I looked out at the backyard, the last of the yellow daisies glowing in the late-season sun, and nodded. Ethan went on, "If you sell this house, you'll have plenty for a comfortable retirement. We'll help you manage it." The way he said manage slipped past me then, just a simple promise, or so I thought. I called a realtor, put up a for sale sign. On the day I signed the papers, I took a photo in front of the house and sent it to Ethan. "All done, sweetheart." I packed my life into 3 cardboard boxes, a few picture frames, and one suitcase of clothes. A few weeks later, I was in suburban Seattle. The new key clicked sharply in the lock. The first days were peaceful roast chicken dinners, Melissa's laughter, the kids' photos on the mantle. They talked about ordinary things, about work and school and neighbors. But then, the glue began to peel at the edges. Ethan drove home in a new SUV, the temporary tag taped crooked in the window. The next week, Melissa picked up another one from the dealership. They booked a trip to Las Vegas, talking about credit card rewards and room upgrades. Designer packages started arriving one after another, cardboard boxes stacked in the corner of the garage. I thought maybe they'd gotten raises. But the mail thickened bank letters, credit card statements, payment reminders. On the kitchen counter, the bills piled beneath a glass paperweight. They liked to talk about investments and financial growth. All I saw were red numbers in the bottom right corner of every page. One evening, Melissa poured a glass of orange juice and set it in front of me. "I've got an idea," she said. "It's messy having Mom's money scattered in different places. Let's open a joint account. We'll handle it for you. Make sure all your bills are paid. You won't have to worry about a thing." She said it gently, like offering a chair to someone tired. Perfectly reasonable. I didn't think twice. I trusted them, so I agreed. The next day, we sat together at the bank, signing forms. The clerk smiled, stamped the papers. I left with a confirmation slip and the quiet comfort of believing I'd just organized a part of my old age. 2 weeks later, I checked the account. $50,000 was gone, marked family expense. I printed the statement and brought it downstairs. Ethan was popping open a can of soda. "What's this about?" I asked. He glanced at the paper, lifted his chin. "Oh, don't worry, Mom. Just an advance. Things are tight right now. I'll pay it back." He smiled thin, casual. A chill ran up my spine. I folded the printout and took it upstairs. From then on, checking that account each morning became as routine as taking my pills. One afternoon, as I was peeling apples, I noticed an envelope in the mail tray, a life insurance packet, my late husband's old policy. Inside was a form to change the beneficiary. The blank space for the name had been neatly filled in. Ethan Holden. I picked it up. The paper felt smooth, the ink still fresh. Melissa stepped into the kitchen, opened the fridge and said casually, as if she hadn't noticed what I was holding, "It's just a formality, Mom. Sign it, so we can handle the medical stuff if anything ever happens." I didn't answer. I set the pen down on the table, folded the papers and carried them to my room. The door clicked shut. The house fell silent. Ever since that afternoon when I took the insurance papers upstairs, the air in the house changed color. Melissa no longer had that smooth, polite smile. Every time I walked into the kitchen, she would freeze for half a second, then glance away as if she'd just seen something unpleasant in her path. One evening, I looked for the TV remote to turn on the evening news. It wasn't there. Melissa walked by, flipped her hair, and gave a thin smile. "Forgetful again, Mom? Maybe you should get your memory checked." She slid her hand between the couch cushions and, as if by magic, pulled out the remote perfectly placed on the armrest. Here it is. Another morning, I was getting ready to go to the grocery store. The car keys weren't in the dish by the door as usual. I searched my coat pockets, my purse, nothing. Just as I was about to give up, Melissa came in from the garage, dangling the keyring between her fingers. "Your keys were on top of the dryer. You must have left them there." I looked at her hand, the glossy red nails catching the light. The dryer sat deep in the garage somewhere I rarely ever went. I made a note. Keys, 9:05 a.m. Found on the dryer. I didn't use the dryer today. Then, rumors started seeping out of the house like a slow leak. One afternoon, while I was watering the flowers on the porch, my neighbor Patricia stopped by to hand me a flyer for the school fair. She looked at me a little too long, then spoke in that polite, stumbling tone people use when they're uneasy. "Lately, some folks have said you've been a bit forgetful. Must be the age, huh?" I smiled and asked, "Who said that?" She avoided my eyes, forced a smile, and changed the subject. I didn't press. That night, I opened the neighborhood app and saw a few vague posts. Elderly resident driving confused around the cul-de-sac. Ethan brought up the subject of money, his tone warm, almost caring. "Mom, you should sign a power of attorney for me just in case you ever get too weak. That way, I can help handle your finances, pay bills right away, save you the trouble." I let him finish, then asked, "What exactly is that authorization for?" He explained loosely, as though rehearsed. "It's a durable power of attorney, basically gives me the right to deal with the bank for you if you can't." I nodded, pretending to take it in, but after all the strange little things that had been happening, I didn't sign anything. And then, the details started to lace together like threads. One afternoon, Melissa left a brochure from a memory assessment center on the dining table, held to the fridge by a magnet. Her tone was light, almost kind. "A friend took her mom there. The doctor's wonderful. You should go, just to be sure." "Is there something wrong with me?" I asked. She blinked innocently. "Just in case. We only worry about you." I tucked the brochure into a drawer and added another line to my notebook. They were always finding ways to prove I wasn't well. At the time, I brushed it off, thought it was concern. But now, looking back, I see it for what it truly was. But they had grossly underestimated this old woman, and perhaps that was understandable. They had no idea who I used to be. Before moving to Seattle, my entire life had been numbers, spreadsheets, and reports in Denver, 18 years as chief accountant for a major energy corporation. Inside my head, a plan began to take shape. Quiet, precise, not revenge in the way movies portray it, no drama, no theatrics. Just putting everything back into its rightful place. I opened an old metal box and pulled out a sealed envelope marked in my handwriting. Investment 2003. The yellowed paper inside held a letter confirming my purchase of shares in a small renewable energy company in Boulder. Back then, I had taken $75,000 from bonuses and savings, signed neatly, and believed more in wind and sunlight than in the promises of hyper-growth funds. 20 years later, those shares had swollen like a balloon inflated by careful hands, now worth over $9 million. No one in the family knew. I'd hidden it like an underground spring beneath concrete. If they wanted to steal from their mother, they'd first have to find out who their mother really was. I opened my laptop. The screen's glow reflected off my glasses as my fingers found their place on the keys, steady as an old pianist keeping time. I logged into my brokerage account, verified two-factor authentication, checked every detail, share quantities, split dates, dividend rights, beneficiary addresses, not a single gap. Then I opened the bank account settings, reviewed every payment authorization, and disabled anything unnecessary. Each step, I took a screenshot and saved it to a password-protected folder. By noon, I called Thomas Avery, my old attorney in Denver. His voice was still deep and slow, just as I remembered. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Margaret?" "I want to review all beneficiary designations, update my contacts, and verify any durable power of attorney currently on file." "Understood. I'll send a checklist. Anything else?" "Yes. I want written assurance that no future changes can be made without my direct confirmation. No proxy signatures, no forwarded authorizations." "Got it." I opened the family folder inside the metal box. My husband's death certificate, the life insurance contract, the retirement account statements. I laid them all out on the bed, arranging them along a line: assets, beneficiaries, access. On each packet, I drew a small box with a pencil beside independent verification, meaning any change must go through a face-to-face call or biometric check. No one would ever speak for me on a noisy phone line again. The room dimmed around me, leaving only the light from the screen across my cheek. The rain outside blended with the sound of my typing, a rhythm that calmed me in a strange, deliberate way. I told myself, they might defeat a weak old mother, but they'll never outmatch a woman who spent her life inside the numbers. This wasn't a vow. It was a standard operating procedure. I closed the browser tabs, backed up all the data to an external drive, and slipped it into the inner pocket of my coat. Before shutting down the laptop, I opened my leather notebook, a fresh page. The pen moved in one clean stroke. I wrote, Step 1, cut access. Step 2, secure evidence. Step 3, leave before they notice. I dotted the final period a small black mark that looked like a lock. Then I folded the notebook shut, the dry snap of leather echoing softly. The rain kept falling steady, rhythmic, like breathing exercises. I turned off the light. And in the darkness, I could finally see it clearly, the invisible lines connecting every item on my plan into one single path. Straight, clean, and without looking back. The next morning, I put on a heavy coat and slipped the leather notebook into my pocket. The bank opened at 9. I arrived 10 minutes early and sat on the bench near the service counter. When my name appeared on the screen, I stood and walked forward. "I'd like to permanently close my joint account," I said clearly. The clerk checked my ID, looked up and asked, "Would you like to keep online access to review past transactions?" "No need. Just a printed copy of the last 6 months' statements. May I ask why, ma'am?" "For record keeping." She nodded and typed a few lines. I opened an envelope, pulled out a confirmation slip, and requested an additional receipt. The next step, opening a new personal account. I enabled two-factor authentication and changed all the security questions. When the screen flashed "Setup complete," I signed the transfer order, moving all proceeds from the house sale into the new account. No excess trace left behind. Leaving the bank, I headed to the post office. In my bag were 2 sealed envelopes, letters to the insurance company requesting a lock on beneficiary changes. The message was direct and brief. Any future change would require my personal confirmation with ID verification. I paid for express delivery, with signature required. On the way home, I called Thomas Avery. "I need to set up 2 trusts," I said. "One for each grandchild. They'll activate when the kids turn 18. Funds are to be used for education and therapy, if needed, managed and dispersed only by an independent trustee. Their parents will have no access." Thomas asked a few details. I answered concisely and emailed the documents. He scheduled a signing date. I hung up and noted the time in my book. That afternoon, I drafted another document, a report on elder financial abuse. I wrote the full term elder financial abuse, EFA, and briefly defined it: coercing signatures, unauthorized transfers, fabricating memory loss to seize control. I attached a detailed list of incidents: Melissa's constant memory checkup reminders, the advances, Ethan's request for a durable power of attorney, everything I'd documented in my notes. I sent the letter to both my lawyer and the bank, asking that it be kept on file. My desk was covered in thin folders, each labeled neatly: insurance, new account, trusts, statements, screenshots. I aligned the edges. In a separate envelope, I kept a copy of the beneficiary change form with Melissa's handwriting, clean and slightly tilted to the right. Evidence doesn't need to shout, it just needs to be in the right place. Everything was done quietly. No announcements. I turned the printer to low volume, clipped each document in order. Before shutting it off, I exported a time-stamped summary, a log of my own actions. I read through it once and drew a single final line: done. By dusk, I returned to the Seattle house like a guest. The sky had darkened. Ethan wasn't home yet. Melissa was upstairs, her footsteps quick, restless. I went to the kitchen and turned on the counter light. The stone surface gleamed. The mail tray was askew. I didn't touch it. From my coat pocket, I took out a checkbook, tore one sheet. No signature. In blue ink, slightly messy on purpose, I wrote, "For Ethan and Melissa, with love, Mom." I placed the blank check squarely in the middle of the table, beside a pen that had run dry. I opened the cupboard, took a glass, and poured water. Every motion measured, deliberate. I stood for a while, looking around. The fridge plastered with payment schedules, the dish towel I'd folded still hanging by the sink, the oven holding the warmth of their rushed dinner. Nothing in this house belonged to me anymore, except the silence I'd brought in with me. Upstairs, I pulled the suitcase from under the bed. The clothes were already folded. The external drive sat in my coat pocket. The leather notebook on top, pen ready. I turned off the light and stood for a minute, letting my eyes adjust to the dark. Downstairs, the garage door opened, then shut. I waited for voices. None came. Only the rain whispering against the roof tiles. By midnight, the house sank into heavy sleep. I closed my eyes too, but never relaxed. At 4:40 a.m., I got up. Washed, dressed, rolled my suitcase downstairs. The porch light blinked on with the motion sensor. I hung the house keys on the hook, took one last look toward the kitchen, the check still there, the blue ink dry. I opened the door. The morning air brushed my face cold, clean. The front yard glistened with leftover rain, the streetlight stretching soft amber streaks across the puddles. I rolled the suitcase gently down the steps, careful not to let the wheels bump. The door closed behind me with a small sound, like a period at the end of a sentence. Out on the street, I called for a car. While waiting, I looked back at the house, not out of longing, but to confirm it still stood there, a fixed point on the map. The kitchen light glowed dim. No one stirred. When the car arrived, I loaded the suitcase into the trunk and sat in the back seat. The driver asked where to. "The temporary apartment in Portland," I said. He nodded and pulled into the lane. The city was still asleep. I leaned my head against the seat, listening to the windshield wipers brush rhythmically across the glass. Inside, silence. Outside, rain. I thought about my 2 grandchildren, their trust funds already in motion, signatures pending within days. I thought about the copies, the emails, the timestamps, everything exactly where it needed to be. As the car crossed the bridge, the river wind grew stronger. I opened my notebook, wrote a single line, and closed it. I didn't look back. In my mind, my voice settled into a whisper. I walked out of that house carrying nothing but freedom, and $9 million they never knew existed. At the Central Bus Terminal, I transferred to a long-distance coach headed for Portland. The seat was hard, the air conditioning too cold, and the air smelled faintly of new plastic. I slid my suitcase under the seat and held my handbag close. On the interstate, the sun crept up behind a bank of gray clouds. The pine forests on both sides stood like mile markers. I mentally checked through my list. New account transferred, insurance locked, trusts pending signature, EFA letter sent. Every door I needed to close was now closed. Portland greeted me with fine rain. I checked into a serviced apartment on the 10th floor front desk downstairs, keycard access for the elevator. The room was clean, minimal, a small kitchen, a large bed, a window overlooking the river. I did a slow circuit, checked the locks, the deadbolt, the smoke detector. Then I went to the corner store for essentials. A toothbrush, a razor, 2 white mugs, a box of black tea. The first text arrived while I was boiling water. "Ethan, Mom, where are you?" Less than a minute later, "Ethan, came home, you weren't here. Tried calling, no answer. Text back right now." I set the phone down, poured the hot water into the mug, and waited for the tea to steep. The screen lit again. "Ethan, we need to talk. You can't just do this." The phone buzzed once more. "Ethan, you left a check on the kitchen table. What's that about? Is it for us?" A minute later, "Ethan, why isn't it signed?" "Without a signature, the bank won't cash it." I watched the screen, the frantic dots pulsing as he typed. Then Melissa's message followed, sharp and crowded. "Melissa, what do you mean by this? You wrote, 'For Ethan and Melissa, love Mom but didn't sign.' Is that supposed to be funny?" "What are you trying to say?" Ethan called immediately. I didn't pick up. Messages kept coming. "Ethan, I don't understand. If you didn't mean to help, why write it at all?" I typed slowly. "The unsigned check is to remind you both that nothing has value without a signature in the right place. I won't sign anything that erases my boundaries." A brief pause, then Melissa changed tone. "Melissa, so what? You want to provoke us? You want us to get on our knees for your signature?" I locked the screen and set the phone face down. Only the sound of rain tapping against the glass remained. When people exhaust every trick, pleading, guilt, threat to pull you back into orbit, an unsigned check becomes the simplest answer. I no longer sign away my limits. 15 minutes later, Melissa again, her style shifting to soft persuasion. "Melissa, we're worried, Mom. Where are you so we can come get you?" Then, "Melissa, you're being selfish. This is your home too. Why would you leave in the middle of the night?" Followed by, "Melissa, I told the neighbors you might be lost. They're asking questions. You realize we could sue you for neglecting family responsibilities?" I took a sip of tea, opened my leather notebook, and logged the time and a short summary of each message. Then I replied once, as clean and final as a stamp, "I'm safe. Don't contact me again. And if you want to sue, go ahead and try." Silence lasted about 10 minutes. Then the phone rang Ethan again. I let it buzz. Once, twice, a third time. I switched the phone to silent and left it face down. Soon the voicemail filled up. "Mom, pick up. We just want to talk. You're tearing this family apart. I sat by the window, watching the rain blur across the glass, listening to the drops strike metal like a secret Morse code. On the other side of that screen, panic was building its rhythm. I kept mine steady, slow, clear, unreactive. Out in the hallway, suitcases rolled past, travelers came and went, renting by the day. I made another pot of tea and video called Thomas Avery, using my new number. He confirmed the trust documents had arrived, scheduled the remote signing for the next day, and asked me to have my ID and verification answers ready. I agreed and sent him a scanned copy of the insurance form with Melissa's handwriting as evidence. He replied, "Stick to procedure. Don't explain a thing to anyone." The old phone buzzed again on the table. Melissa's message turned bitter. "Melissa, you're embarrassing me. The neighbors won't stop talking. Do you even know what family means?" I didn't answer. I stood, drew the curtain back, and cracked the window to let the damp air in. Near midnight, Ethan sent one last message. "Ethan, I'm sorry if I said anything wrong. Just tell me where you are." Then another. "Ethan, we're worried about you." I read it, locked the screen, and placed the phone in the drawer, then turned the key. Lights off. The room sealed quiet, as a vault. When everything was still, I stood by the window, both hands wrapped around the warm cup of tea. Portland was still raining. People hurried below, shoulders hunched, raincoats puffed by the wind. I whispered, just loud enough for myself to hear, "Don't look back." Then I closed the curtains, turned to the table, opened my notebook, and drew one clean line through the boldest words on the page. Final severance. Monday morning, I woke to the steady sound of rain against the railing. My new phone was silent, but the inbox of my private email glowed. A forwarded notice from the bank, addressed to the primary account holder Ethan, about a meeting scheduled as the final review before foreclosure proceedings. I pulled a chair to the desk and read each line slowly. The language was cold. Delinquent, non-compliance, liquidation. I saved the file and placed it in the context folder. By noon, the old phone still locked in the drawer lit up repeatedly. Messages appeared on the lock screen. I only glanced. "Ethan, the bank sent a warning letter. I need you to confirm the last advance so I can explain." A moment later, "Ethan, answer me, Mom." I closed the drawer. There was nothing left to say. That afternoon, an old neighbor from the community, Patricia, sent a text to my new number, probably given to her by someone. "They're saying around here that you're getting confused." I don't believe it. I still see you walking at the same time every morning, bringing the trash bins in before anyone else. I replied briefly, "Thank you. I'm fine." Then I took a screenshot and filed it beside the bank notice. Not to use just to remember that every story has layers. Cornered people don't sit still for long, they strike back. By late afternoon, the first blow came, a sharp, practiced knock. Two people at the door introduced themselves as case officers from the county's Adult and Child Protective Services, a welfare check triggered by an anonymous report. The woman opened a folder. "We received a report saying you live alone, appear disoriented, and might be at risk of self-harm. I invited them in and turned on all the lights." The desk was tidy, files neatly bound, the teapot still steaming. I handed over my ID, my attorney's letter, and the appointment notice for the trust signing. They asked the standard questions: how I eat, if I have emergency contacts, whether I take medication. I answered crisply, showed them the pantry stocked with food, and the list of phone numbers taped inside the cabinet door. The woman closed her folder. Her tone softened. "No signs of danger here. Must be a misunderstanding." "I figured as much," I said, careful not to look directly at the small recorder clipped to her lapel. They left with a report stamped, "No irregularities found." I photographed it and saved it to the context folder. Another attempt to box me into the label "mentally unfit" failed. No argument needed. The next day, the second blow. Doorbell. Through the peephole, I saw a man in a delivery jacket, holding a parcel and a clipboard. "Mrs. Holden, I've got a refund package from your insurance provider. Just need a quick signature." "I haven't filed any refund requests," I said through the door. "Just routine paperwork, ma'am. Sign, and I'll leave it right here." "I don't sign documents I haven't read." "Leave the package at the door. I'll verify with the company." He kept smiling. then lifted the clipboard closer to the peephole just for a split second, long enough for me to catch the faint embossed seal of a mobile notary and the blurred heading, Durable Power of Attorney. I switched on the hallway camera and hit record. Please leave the paperwork with the front desk. This building has a legal department. If you stay here another minute, I'll call security. His expression changed. He shrugged and turned toward the elevator. 2 minutes later, the front desk called up, "Delivery guy's gone." I noted the time and saved the video clip. A forged power of attorney disguised as a refund form, an old trick, but an easy trap if one acts in haste. That evening came the third blow. An email from the insurance company stating, "Beneficiary update pending confirmation." It carried a digital signature from support team. The logo looked perfect except for one misplaced letter in the domain name. I switched to detailed header view, saw the sender's address traced to a foreign server. I forwarded it to Thomas Avery with one word: phishing. His reply arrived in under 5 minutes. Confirmed forgery. Extra security locks are active. No changes possible without your direct ID verification. Leave the rest to me and their cyber division. I starred the email and stored it in the context folder. The door to the insurance was sealed shut now. Every hand reaching for it would touch only the cold surface of a locked gate. 2 days later, a truck from the asset management company stopped in front of the old house. A yellow foreclosure notice was taped to the door. Bank representatives entered to inventory and log the contents. Ethan stood on the porch, face flushed, voice raised. "You can't do this. This is my house." The representative pointed at the seal. "You've been notified. Please step away from the property." Patricia later told me some neighbors filmed with their phones while others looked down and avoided the scene. Moments later, Melissa came down the steps dragging a suitcase, her shoulders stiff. She paused, glanced around, and said flatly, "No money, no family." She opened the door of a friend's car, climbed in, and slammed it shut. That night, an unknown number called. A beat of silence, then Melissa's voice, sharp but thinner now. "How long are you going to let the kids have no place to sleep?" "The kids have beds in a safe place," I replied. "You think you've won, huh? I sent you that refund form to sign, and you pulled a fast one. I refused to sign a disguised power of attorney. Next time, don't send a mobile notary to wait outside my door." She was quiet for a second, then gave a dry laugh. "You're a sly old woman, alert enough to read a document header. Good night." I hung up and blocked the number. No raised voice, no explanation. Just the same work as before, holding the line. Their efforts had failed, and now it was their turn to pay the real price. Ethan and Melissa's social media history began to change color. The Vegas check-in photos disappeared, replaced by posts selling shoes, handbags, watches. Barely used. Great price. Underneath, a few comments asked about unpaid debts. I scrolled past, left no reaction. Later, Melissa texted, "A friend can get us a short-term loan, but the interest is high. Can you confirm for us, just so we can borrow sooner?" I let the message sit. Not replying is also a decision. That afternoon, I had a video call with Thomas Avery. He said, "Keep silent, no comments. All official documents have been filed. If they make noise, the EFA report and your logs speak for themselves." I nodded, ended the call, and went to make tea. The kettle trembled once, the sound of boiling water ticking like heavier rain on glass. And then, when it was nearly over, Melissa dragged a suitcase down the steps again, slammed it hard. She said, her voice brittle, "No money, no family." Patricia heard it while watering her garden outside. A friend's car pulled up to the curb. Melissa opened the door, climbed in, never looked back. I imagined the sound of that car door closing, a heavy final thud, like a hammer sealing her words. Ethan texted my old phone. "They've sealed the house. I need you to talk to the bank." "Please, Mom." I placed the phone back in the drawer and locked it. Not out of cruelty, just because everything had finally settled into its rightful place, and I wasn't about to pull it out again. The next morning, the local paper ran a short piece. Suburban home foreclosed after owner failed to meet payment obligations. Asset management office confirms procedure followed state law. No names, no address. Just a low-angle photo showing the corner of the yellow notice. I bought the print edition, folded it carefully. In Portland, the rain hung still. I set the newspaper beside the teapot, poured a full cup, and sat down. On the table lay the thickened leather notebook, its yellow tabs marking each milestone. I didn't add commentary or size, just wrote the date and one closing line of my own. After a difficult process, every financial thread has fallen into its proper place. I closed the notebook and lifted the cup of tea. On the far bank of this story, they were panicking. On mine, I was simply breathing evenly. No one pushed anyone. The weight of decisions finds its own gravity. The rain slowed. I stood, placed the newspaper into the context envelope, and stapled it shut. The room was as still as a vault. I walked to the window and looked down at the river, its surface calm again. Nothing more needed to be done. Everything had already been said in action. The message came that evening. I want to talk in person. I stared at the screen for a long time, then typed, tomorrow, 10 o'clock. The cafe across from Portland City Hall. I chose a table by the window, bright light, plenty of people passing by. I arrived 10 minutes early and ordered an Americano. Inside my bag, the envelope of documents was ready. Ethan walked in just as the clock struck 10. His jacket was wrinkled, eyes shadowed, stubble rough. He held a paper cup in both hands, as if to warm them. No small talk. I need you to help me one last time. I placed the envelope on the table and opened it. First, a copy of the insurance beneficiary change formed the name field already filled in by hand. Next, a photo of the bank statement with the note, family expense. Finally, several pages of my notes detailing every time they'd urged me to sign a DPOA, dates and times exact. I turned each page so he could see clearly. You know what this is, I said. Ethan looked, lips pressed tight, throat shifting. I thought it was the fastest way to save the family. We were stuck. Family doesn't require secrets, I said slowly, letting each word fall flat on the table. And it never needs a forced signature. He gripped his cup tighter, knuckles whitening. Outside, a bus pulled up, its doors opening with a gust of damp air. Ethan's voice dropped low. The bank won't delay anymore. If I can make a partial payment, they'll reconsider. You could sell some shares, just a small part. I'll pay it back. I met his eyes. No. He blinked, as if unsure he'd heard right. I continued, calm and clear. The 2 children will have their trust funds and their future. That's their share. As for you, you're responsible for every bill with your name on it. Ethan started to argue, then fell silent. His lips trembled. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. I promised Melissa I'd fix it. The words dropped to the floor like a bent coin. I pulled the insurance form closer, tapped the handwritten name. Who filled this out? Ethan said nothing. I didn't wait. Melissa's handwriting, but you knew it was here. You let it stay. You called that convenient. He lowered his head. After a long pause, he said quietly, I didn't think it would go this far. At first, it was just small advances. Then the payments, then the spiral. That's when adults stop, I said, not when they start looking for shortcuts. The barista set down coffee at the next table, the clink of cups soft and precise. I let the silence spread, offering no advice. I've learned that silence can answer better than words. Ethan suddenly looked up. You could move back in for a while just so the bank sees another adult in the house. No. I cut him off, not harshly, but final. You're not inviting me home out of love. You're inviting me home to open the safe. That door is closed for good. His shoulders slumped. Rain began to fall harder, tapping the glass with gray spots. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. I slid the envelope to the center of the table. Copies, dates, names. If you ever tell anyone I'm senile, remember I hold all the evidence to the contrary. He nodded slightly, like someone receiving a sentence. You must hate me, he said. I don't, I replied. I'm protecting what's human in me. No one else can do that for me. At the far corner, 2 students argued over a presentation. An older man flipped through a newspaper. The barista called out orders in a steady voice. The cafe's normal hum covered the uneven rhythm of Ethan's breathing. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, clumsy, unable to hide it. I didn't hand him a napkin. I let him deal with his tears the way he must deal with his debts on his own. What will you do now? I asked. I'll Find side work. Sell whatever's left. Try to negotiate a payment plan with the bank. Do it. And, will you? I'll stay in Portland for a while. My affairs are settled. He nodded, stood first, still holding the empty paper cup like it might slip away. He turned, didn't look back. The door opened, the bell chimed softly. A gust of rain swept in, then the door closed behind him. My table was still covered with documents, aligned neatly like ruled lines on school paper. I sat 5 more minutes, finished the Americano, then gathered the papers and slid them back into the envelope. In my notebook I wrote, date, time, location, subject, proposal to sell shares declined, evidence confirmed, boundary non-negotiable. I put the envelope in my bag, zipped it, and left the cafe. Back at the apartment, I placed it in the locked drawer of the desk, then lay down on the bed awake, staring at the ceiling, letting the thoughts turn over. I never truly knew how much Ethan had been carrying. He began to fracture that afternoon in the hospital in Eugene, the day his father's heart monitor went silent with a single flat beep. The room was white, air conditioning cold and constant. The nurse drew the curtain with practiced efficiency. Ethan stood by the door, hands buried in the pockets of a hastily rented suit jacket, fingernails pressing deep into the lining. He didn't cry. He watched me sign the confirmation papers the way one watches a machine sign, stamp, done. Out in the hallway, he said only 4 words, "Let me handle it." That night, he drove me home himself, opened doors, arranged the funeral details, called the mortuary, confirmed the visitation schedule. He turned everything into a checklist. Late that night, I heard the garage door close and the car engine idle longer than usual. I learned later he had sat there in the dark, gripping the steering wheel until his hands went numb. The funeral was small, held at a suburban cemetery. My husband's old friends came, spoke in short phrases, patted Ethan's shoulder as though tapping stone. Someone asked if he was all right. He nodded, offered the same preloaded answer. "I'm fine. I'll take care of Mom." Ethan wore that face for a long time. He cleaned out the garage, packed all his father's tools into labeled boxes. When he placed the old steel ruler into the final box, his hand paused, then shut the lid a bit too hard. In the weeks that followed, in Seattle, he chose silence over sharing. Melissa wanted the house to lose the smell of grief, to start a new page, and Ethan agreed too quickly. He showed me a color-coded spreadsheet titled Family Plan, with one column labeled Goal, Keep Everything from Breaking. But how to do that, he never said. He started buying, upgrading like each new thing might patch an invisible crack. The first SUV arrived as a self-given reward. It's safer, easier to drive Mom around. Then came the Vegas trip. You need a change of scene. It wasn't me who needed that, it was him. He needed the noise, the lights, the sterile quiet of a hotel night to convince himself everything was still working. Leaving Vegas at dawn, I noticed his eyes were red, his left hand trembling slightly. He blamed it on lack of sleep. I believed him, or chose to, for peace of mind. Later, when everything collapsed, Ethan called me one late night. "I'm scared the family's falling apart, Mom," he said. "When Dad died, I promised myself nothing else would break. I thought if I just rode harder, I could hold us together, you and me." Then came the sound of heavy breathing, fading slowly. I pictured him in a rented room, hand on his chest, counting breaths like someone learning to breathe again. His "I didn't want the family to break" had somehow steered us straight into the fracture. When I understood that, I blamed myself. I had let him handle it for too long. I had stepped off stage, thinking silence was respect. I should have asked him to take walks, pulled him to sit on the porch steps, and called the thing by its name, grief. I should have said, "You're allowed to be weak," instead of praising him for being strong. But I don't let myself drown in sentimentality. Guilt only means something if it changes behavior. So I started speaking to him simply, clearly, within my own boundary. "I love you, but I won't sign for you. I'm here when you want to talk about your father, not about money." 2 weeks later, he texted that he'd booked a session. "I don't know what to say," he wrote. "Start with what you never said," I replied. For the first time, his silence was different, neither defensive nor avoidant. After that first session, he called to tell me that just saying the words, "My father died," had stunned him. The therapist asked when he'd last hugged his dad. He couldn't remember. They didn't discuss finances. They talked about a 7th-grade boy, hands trembling as he held up a science trophy, scanning the crowd for his mother's eyes. As I listened, something inside me, an old drawer, slid open. I kept my boundaries intact. I didn't give him anything except time and attention. I told him, strength isn't about paying every emotional debt with money. Strength is knowing when to stop the car before it's going too fast. I reminded him of the 2 letters I'd written for his children. When he reads them, he'll tell them their father learned a hard lesson and learned it in time. I don't know where the future will place Ethan, but I do know this. The pain of losing his father forced him into a role far too small for his grief. My job now isn't to comfort him so he can keep performing. It's to close the curtain, point to the wings and say, you're allowed to step off stage, breathe, and come back as yourself. I do that by standing straight, speaking in few words, and enduring the silences. I'm not saving him. I'm letting him grow up while standing beside him, in the human part of me, exactly as I am. Melissa left that house on a gray afternoon, dragging a suitcase that screeched across the porch steps. Patricia told me in a brief call that after a few days staying at a friend's, Melissa turned off her phone, changed her number, and vanished from Ethan's contacts. I wasn't surprised. The one who leaves first is always the one who believes they were trapped because of someone else. Ethan moved into a cheap rental on the outskirts, near the interstate, a place with walls so thin he could hear the neighbors cough at night. He picked up extra shifts at the warehouse, hauling boxes until his back burned, and spent weekends delivering food. All the shine disappeared as fast as it had arrived. The watch sold, the shoes sold, the gym membership canceled, the credit card cut. His social media went silent. Old photos erased, leaving a stretch of empty space. The pride of a middle-aged American man faded alongside his muscle tone. I knew all this not because I was watching him, but because the fragments found their way to me through Patricia's short messages, stray bits of news, and sometimes from Ethan himself, in the length of his silences between the few texts he sent. Late one night, close to midnight, my new phone buzzed. I looked at the caller ID, hesitated a beat, then answered. Ethan's voice was hoarse, exhausted. The kind that comes after a night shift. I'm not making excuses anymore. I was wrong. I said nothing. On the other end, I could hear the hum of an air conditioner, the rush of cars outside. A silence long enough for the next words to feel unperformed. I thought I had to prove something to Melissa, to my friends, to myself. I thought if I looked successful, everything would fall into place. People at work always talk about shortcuts, cash advances, small loans, a little shuffle, then pay it back later. I stepped onto that grass like it was solid ground. Didn't see the hole. Then just kept sliding down into debt. I leaned back in my chair, looking out the window. I stayed quiet until his breathing slowed. I heard you, I said. If you want to get back what you've lost, now you'll have to listen to me. Okay. His voice was softer then, almost a whisper. I'm grateful, Mom. Don't thank me. Thank your kids while they still believe their father shows up on time. He gave a short, broken laugh that carried more shame than humor, then fell silent. I heard water running somewhere, maybe a sink. I pictured him standing in a cramped kitchen with an old faucet, fluorescent light buzzing, the faint scent of cheap detergent. Not because I wanted to imagine it, but because rented rooms in America all tend to look the same once you close your eyes. When can I see you? He asked, voice uncertain, like testing cold water with his hand. When you can talk without mentioning money. I spoke slowly, each word set down like a stone on tile. A long silence followed. No air conditioner, no cars. I imagined Ethan sitting on the edge of the bed, his hand pressed to his forehead. I'll try, he said, barely audible. Trying isn't enough, I replied, but it's a start. Keep your work schedule, pay your debts on time, get a checkup. And don't lie to your kids. One day they'll ask why they had to move. Answer with just enough truth. I understand. His voice dropped a notch, like stepping back into balance. Mom, do you hate me? I don't keep space in me for that, I said plainly. I have work to do. So do you. Ethan exhaled once, sharply, then calmed. Good night, Mom. Good night. The call ended. I set the phone on the table and listened to the rain ease into a softer rhythm. The room was dark, lit only by the reflection of car lights over the river. I stood, filled the kettle, and set it on the stove. Before it boiled, I went back to my chair, head leaning against the backrest. On the wall was his father's photo, the man in a white shirt, smiling straight at the camera the day we bought our first house in Eugene. "If you were here, would you agree with the things I'm doing now?" I asked quietly, for no one else to hear. I didn't cry. Crying is a kind of release useful, but not always right on time. I opened the leather notebook and wrote 4 short lines. Ethan called, 11:40, 1 p.m. Admitted fault, no mention of money. Agreed to meet only when finances aren't discussed. I closed it and set the pen across the top like a paperweight on a still wet page. The night stretched long, but it no longer swallowed me. Each decision now had its rightful place, and so did the loneliness. It sat in the chair across from me, silent, unintrusive, like a shadow with clear edges. I poured myself a glass of water and turned back toward the window. Below, the Willamette kept flowing. A slow freight ship cut through the dark, its lights blinking steadily, unhurried. People often mistake dignity for the easy path. The truth is the opposite. Dignity demands endurance, asks you to sit through long silences, to live without comfort. But it's the only path that lets you look in the mirror each morning and owe no explanation to anyone, not even yourself. I dimmed the lights until only one small lamp remained. The kettle whistled once, dry and sharp. I turned off the stove, left it as it was. No tea tonight. I stood for a moment longer at the window, then drew the curtains. Heading to bed, I thought about tomorrow signing the trust papers, contacting the school to ask about scholarship procedures. Quiet work, small steps. One stone at a time. Before lying down, I picked up his photo and wiped a thin layer of dust from the frame. My hand was steady. I set it back in place and took a deep breath. The loneliness was still there, but it had changed, less raw, less sharp, like a thin layer of air between myself and the world. I pulled up the blanket and closed my eyes. Somewhere out there, Ethan was probably lying on an old spring mattress under a stained ceiling, holding a phone that no longer lit up with messages like, "Vegas this weekend?" The future isn't made of steel. It's built from habit. If he changes his habits, he'll change his future. My part is done keeping my back straight, keeping my humanity intact. The rest I leave to time and the paths we each have to walk. Outside, Portland was still raining. I drifted to sleep with a faint ache under my breastbone, a kind of pain that reminded me I was still alive, and that the price I pay each day is the price of dignity. I accept it one day at a time. I moved into a small apartment near a park in Oregon just as the rainy season began. It's on the 3rd floor of an old brick building. The wooden stairs smell faintly of varnish, and the windows look down over a row of maples. The balcony is narrow, just enough space for 3 lavender pots. Every morning I water them, and the clean fragrance rises like a soft cloth wiping dust from the mind. On the wall across from my bed, I've hung 3 photographs. Our wedding, the day we bought our first house in Eugene, and one of Ethan in 7th grade holding his science trophy. Not for nostalgia, but as a reminder that I once walked from point A to point B on my own 2 feet. My days follow a steady rhythm, like a slow piece of music. At 6, I walk around the park, circle the pond, listen to the ducks stir the water. At noon, I read by the window books about trees, about how people manage time, and a few lean detective novels. In the evening, I open my laptop and log into the email account I use for legal matters. An old, careful habit, checking notices from the trust management company, maintenance confirmations, reassessment schedules. If nothing looks unusual, I mark a small note in my ledger. Stable. That single check mark gives me peace. One long rainy afternoon, I took out stationery with fine lines and began writing letters to my 2 grandchildren. In the first, I told them about their grandfather, a man who believed that money was a tool, not a goal. I wrote about his early mornings, carrying a lunchbox to the construction site, about his cracked hands patiently setting each frame of a house. I told them happiness comes slowly but surely, like planting a maple tree. The first year it's all bare branches. By the 5th year there's shade. I advise them, when you earn your first dollar, divide it 1 part to live, 1 part for stormy days, and 1 part to remind yourself you still dream. I didn't mention success. I wrote about steady work, kept promises, and honesty. In the second letter, I wrote about signatures. In plain language, I told them, some signatures take your freedom away, like when you sign without reading or let others decide for you because you don't want the hassle. Other signatures help you keep yourself, like when you sign an agreement you understand or refuse to sign something that would hurt others. I mentioned the checkboxes on websites, rental contracts, bank commitments, all of them are first commitments to yourself. I wrote that their grandmother had to relearn this lesson late in life, and she was proud she did, to sign where it's right and refuse what steals her dignity. At the end, I made no promises of reward. I wrote, if someday life feels hard, read these 2 letters again before you decide. I sealed each letter in its own envelope, wrote their names, and placed them in the safe beside the trust charters. Then I called the management company and instructed, when they turn 21, send the letters along with a summary of the trust terms and follow up with a phone call to explain clearly. I want them to understand this isn't a gift that fell from above, I said. It's responsibility paired with opportunity. The representative replied, we understand. A few weeks later, I went back to Seattle once one final act of closure. The rain was steady. I stood on the sidewalk across from our old house, under the awning of a small cafe. A new family lives there now, the door painted a lighter color. Children rode bikes in circles up the driveway. Their father stood on the porch steps holding an umbrella, laughing. The mother bent to pull a bag of balls into the garage, scolding affectionately too softly for me to hear. I didn't feel sad. I just felt time moving at its proper pace, not a beat off. The street was the same, the maples still standing, the mailbox still tilted, the faint oil stains still on the pavement. Only the faces had changed. That was enough. I didn't ring the doorbell. I didn't message anyone from the neighborhood. I stayed 5 more minutes, listening to the rain drum on car roofs and shingles, then turned away. On the walk back to the station, I passed flower stands, brown paper bundles of tulips ready to be taken home, trimmed, and placed in a vase to brighten someone's kitchen. Cities survive on small, decent habits like that. I like that thought. I got back to Oregon at sunset. The sky hung low, clouds torn into ribbons, light tilting through the maples like diluted honey. I hung my coat, opened the window to let in the scent of rain. The kettle whistled, calling me back to the present. I poured tea, sat at my table, and looked around the room. Books aligned, dish towel folded, lavender pots still damp. The lamp cast a warm golden circle. Quietly, I said, as though closing a long case file, in a world where a single signature can alter a life, I've learned to sign where I must and refuse where my dignity is at stake. The words weren't meant to convince anyone. They were meant for me so that tomorrow, when I look in the mirror, I'll still recognize the woman standing there. I cleared the cup, locked the safe, turned off most of the lights. Outside, the rain fell steady, so steady you could measure it by a heartbeat. Somewhere across the city, people were eating dinner, turning on the TV, closing laptops, and I breathed deeply. The lamplight settled softly on the wooden table, drawing everything into a calm, contained space. Life isn't simpler because I've survived the storm, it's just tidier because I know what to keep and what to let go. I set down my teacup, heard it touch the wood with a small, perfect sound like a clean signature at the end of a blank page. The story you just heard is fictional, but every breath, every decision within it touches a raw truth. Sometimes the person who seems weakest in everyone else's eyes is the only one clear-headed enough to hold on to themselves. Names and details have been changed to protect the identities of those who might be recognized. We tell this story not to glorify coldness or revenge, but to remind you of this. Dignity doesn't appear on its own. It's defended, signature by signature, refusal by refusal. Margaret Holden didn't fight with shouting. She fought with disciplined silence by putting everything in its right place. She didn't defeat anyone, she simply stopped letting others define who she was, and sometimes that's the only victory that truly matters. If you've ever been used, dismissed, or underestimated because you trusted too much, leave a comment below. And if you believe that real justice doesn't need noise, only someone brave enough to say, "That's enough," share this video. Somewhere out there, someone might find the courage to sign where they should and refuse to sign away what's right. Don't forget to subscribe, because here, every story is a reminder, justice isn't thunder. It's the steady heartbeat of ordinary people who refuse to bow. On the final screen, we're sharing 2 more stories about people who chose to stand up, reclaim their humanity, and find freedom in the quietest way possible. I promise you won't be able to look away.